I'd driven 4 hours through the Great Basin on a Tuesday because Clyde Salinas called me 3 times in 2 weeks, and the third call didn't sound like him anymore. That's the short version. The longer version is that I've been doing this work for 11 years through the Nevada Department of Wildlife, which is a title that sounds more official than it is. What it actually means is that I drive out to wherever someone's reporting something that doesn't fit. I look at what's there, and I write a report. Most of the time it's coyotes. Sometimes it's weather. Sometimes it's a person who's been alone in the desert too long and started seeing things that aren't there. Every now and then, it's something else. Those are the calls I take seriously, and Salinas's third call was one of those. The first call was professional. He was a wildlife biologist stationed at Great Basin National Park, monitoring bat populations in Lehman caves, and he'd noticed something irregular in the cave system that he thought warranted outside consultation. His words: he was careful, qualified, the way scientists get when they don't want to commit to something they can't prove yet. I took his number and told him to document whatever he was seeing. The second call was less careful. He said there'd been an incident involving visitors to the backcountry. He said the Park Service had been notified, but he didn't think they understood the scope of it. He used the phrase "scope of it" twice. I told him I'd look into it. The third call came at 11:47 at night. He didn't say hello. He just started talking, and the hedging language was gone, and by the time he stopped talking, I was already looking for my keys. I got to the visitor center around 2 in the afternoon. The parking lot was mostly empty. A minivan, a couple of dusty sedans, a Park Service truck parked sideways near the building. The kind of quiet that happens in October when the summer crowds are gone and the place is running on skeleton staff. Salinas was waiting outside the main entrance. I recognized him from the department photo on his research profile, but just barely. The photo showed someone who looked like a professor on a field trip. Wire-rimmed glasses, neat hair, the kind of face that looks like it spends a lot of time reading. The person standing on the concrete outside the visitor center looked like that same guy after a month of not sleeping. His hair was unwashed. His fleece pullover was dirty at the cuffs. He'd lost weight he didn't really have to lose, and his cheeks had gone hollow in a way that made his glasses sit differently on his face. "Benny," he said. "Clyde." I shook his hand. His grip was fine, but his hand was cold. 62 degrees out, full sun. That part bugged me a little. I'd brought a thermos of coffee from a gas station in Ely. I offered him some. He shook his head and said he hadn't been able to drink coffee for about a week. Didn't explain why. I didn't push it. We sat at a picnic table around the side of the building, away from the entrance. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them while he talked. He told me about the spelunkers. 4 of them had entered the backcountry cave system over the past month. Not Lehman Caves proper, which is the mapped and guided section, but the backcountry fissure system up the trail, which is accessible but not maintained and not really advertised. People go up there anyway. Hikers, amateur cavers, the kind of people who see a crack in a hillside and think that sounds interesting. 3 of the 4 hadn't come back out. The one who did come back out had been found sitting on the trail about a quarter mile from the fissure entrance by a day hiker who called it in. He was dehydrated and had lacerations on both hands and couldn't say what had happened to the other 3, couldn't give a timeline, couldn't describe anything clearly. The one detail that came through, the one thing he kept repeating, was that the breathing had seemed to come from the walls. Salinas said this flatly, like he'd already turned it over so many times it had stopped feeling strange to say out loud. The breathing had seemed to come from the walls. I wrote it down in my field notebook. I've got bad handwriting. That's me. I asked him what the Park Service response had been. He said they'd done a search of the main cave system and found nothing, and that they were treating the missing persons as a separate matter from whatever the survivor had reported, which he said with a tone that made clear what he thought of that approach. I asked him if he'd been inside the backcountry fissure himself. He looked at his hands again. "Once," he said. "3 weeks ago, I didn't go far." He didn't say what he'd seen or heard in there. I didn't ask yet. I figured I'd see it myself. We walked the trail up from the visitor center, heading northeast into the scrub and limestone. The path was marked and maintained for the first half mile, then it got rougher. Salinas walked fast and didn't talk much. The air smelled like sage and dust and something underneath that I couldn't place yet. About 100 yards off the marked trail, through a gap in the brush that you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, the fissure was there. It was narrow, maybe 2 feet across at the widest point, running vertically in the limestone face of a low outcrop. Not dramatic looking, not the kind of thing that would make you stop and stare. Just a crack in the rock with darkness inside it. I crouched at the entrance and looked at the ground. The drag marks were there. 2 parallel lines in the dirt, pulling inward toward the fissure, like something had been dragged through the opening from outside. They were wide enough to be a person. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could into the dark, and then they disappeared. The smell hit me when I got close. Copper and wet stone. I've smelled copper before in fieldwork, and it's never a good sign. I noted it and kept going. I stood up and looked at Salinas. "I need to go in." He shook his head. Not slowly, not with any hesitation. "Just no." "I figured," I said. "Will you stay out here and monitor radio contact?" He said he would. He said it like it was the only thing he could still offer, and he knew it. I went back to my truck and geared up. Headlamp, fresh batteries, thermal scanner, the Fluke model I'd been using for 3 years, calibrated in August, tranquilizer rifle with a compound I'd been using since the Oregon job 2 years back, which had dropped a 600-pound unclassified in under 4 minutes. I loaded 2 darts and put 2 more in my jacket pocket. I clipped the radio to my vest and checked the channel with Salinas. Clear signal. He was standing 10 feet from the fissure when I came back up the trail. He didn't move any closer. "Stay away from the entrance," I told him. "I know," he said. I turned sideways and squeezed through the fissure. The rock was cold and pressed against my chest and back at the same time. I moved slow, maybe 6 feet of tight passage, and then the walls fell away and I dropped about 18 inches onto the floor of a passage that opened up fast in every direction. I got my footing and raised the headlamp. The passage ran forward and downward, and the ceiling climbed as it went. By the time my light reached the far wall, I was standing at the edge of something that wasn't really a passage anymore. It was a chamber, and it was enormous, and the far wall was at the edge of what my headlamp could reach, which meant it was at least 60 feet away, probably more. I raised the thermal scanner and pointed it into the dark. The reading came back immediately. I looked at it. I recalibrated the scanner and pointed it again. Same reading. I recalibrated a second time, manually, going through each step the way the manual says to do it when you think the instrument is wrong. Same reading. The heat signature was massive, and it was moving. I kept moving. The drag marks were clear enough, 2 parallel lines in the silt with occasional scuff marks beside them, like something had been dragged by the arms with the heels trailing. I'd seen marks like that before once in a cave system outside Elko. That time it was a black bear dragging a deer carcass. I'd been relieved about that. I wasn't relieved now. The passage sloped downward at maybe a 10-degree angle and the ceiling kept climbing. I had to watch the floor more than anything else because the silt was loose in places, and there were sections where the limestone had fractured and left low ridges across the path. I caught one with my boot about 40 feet in and went down on one knee, caught myself on my palm. The rock was cold and damp, and I stayed there a second, just listening. Nothing. Just the drip of water somewhere ahead and the sound of my own breathing. I got up and kept going. The chamber I reached maybe 5 minutes later was different from the passage. The passage had walls. This didn't, not really. My headlamp picked up the far side, but the ceiling was just gone, swallowed up in dark above the beam. I tilted my head back and pointed the light straight up and couldn't find it. That kind of space does something to you. Not panic, just a recalibration. Your brain expects rock above your head in a cave, and when it's not there, it takes a second to adjust. I lowered the light and swept it across the floor. 3 people, arranged in a circle, maybe 12 feet across, each one positioned on their side with their hands tucked under their cheeks, like they were sleeping, like someone had laid them down carefully and made sure they were comfortable. I stood there and looked at that for a while. The wounds were there, yeah. I'm not going to describe them in detail because it doesn't help anything, and I've written enough field reports to know what goes in and what doesn't. What I'll say is, the wounds were consistent with something large and something that didn't use tools. That part I'd seen before. Not often, but before. The arrangement I hadn't seen before. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the bodies themselves, but the fact that something had put them in a circle and laid each one down like it was tucking them in. I stood there, and my brain kept trying to find an explanation for that and kept not finding one. Animals don't do that. Nothing I'd ever documented did that. Whatever this was, it had a reason for it. I didn't know what the reason was, and I didn't want to spend too long thinking about it in that chamber. I unclipped my radio. Salinas. I kept my voice low. Habit. You there? Static. Then his voice, broken up, coming through in pieces. Something that sounded like, yeah, and then a word I couldn't make out, and then more static. Get on the phone, call the park service, and stay away from the fissure. Don't go near it, you understand? More static. A fragment that might have been copy, or might have been something else entirely. Then nothing. The channel went flat and stayed flat. I tried twice more. Nothing. I figured it was the rock. 100 feet of limestone between me and the surface, probably more. Radio signals don't love that. I'd lost contact in caves before, and it had always been signal loss. Always. So I filed it under signal loss and moved on, because I had 3 bodies in front of me and a thermal reading that still hadn't resolved into anything I recognized, and that was enough to deal with. I was wrong about the radio. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I took photos of the chamber and the arrangement, marked the GPS coordinates even though I knew the satellite ping was probably useless this deep. And then I backed up toward the passage. I wasn't going to move the bodies. That wasn't my job, and I didn't have the equipment. And also, I didn't want to disturb whatever the arrangement meant until someone smarter than me had looked at it. I was maybe 20 feet back into the passage when the breathing started. It wasn't a sound, exactly. Or it was a sound, but it was also something else. It came from everywhere at once, low and rhythmic, and I felt it in my sternum before I processed it as hearing. Like standing next to a subwoofer, my chest cavity just picked it up. In, out, slow and steady, and coming from the walls and the floor and the air itself. I pulled out the thermal scanner and pointed it back toward the chamber. The signature had moved. It was close. Close enough that the reading was almost off the top of the scale. I ran. I'm not going to dress that up. There was no tactical retreat, no measured withdrawal. I turned around and I ran back up the passage the way I'd come, headlamp bouncing, boots hitting the limestone ridges I'd been careful about on the way in. I caught one and stumbled and caught myself on the wall and kept going. The breathing stayed with me the whole time. That same low rhythm, and it wasn't getting faster or louder, but it was getting closer. I could feel it getting closer, even when I couldn't hear a difference. My headlamp caught it the first time when I looked back over my shoulder. It was at the edge of the beam, maybe 40 feet back, tall, too tall. The passage ceiling was about 9 feet at that point, and it wasn't walking. It was moving along the wall, one hand on the ceiling, body pressed sideways against the rock like the rock was a floor for it. The skin caught the light and threw it back, wet and gray and pale, and the proportions were wrong in a way that I can describe clinically, but can't really explain. Too long in the limbs, too narrow through the middle, like someone had taken a rough human shape and stretched it in two directions at once. It wasn't running either. It was just moving, and it was faster than it looked. I turned back around and ran harder. The second time I saw it was maybe 20 feet back, same wall and ceiling movement, and I stopped looking after that because looking wasn't helping me. I had the tranq rifle up in my right hand and I fired blind behind me without stopping. Just pointed it back into the dark and pulled the trigger. I heard the dart hit something. Solid impact, a flat thunk, and then the breathing stuttered. One missed beat. Two. Then it came back, slower. I didn't stop. The fissure was ahead. I could see the narrowing of the passage walls in my headlamp, and I hit it at speed and turned sideways and pushed through, chest and back scraping the rock on both sides, and I didn't care. I came out the other end fast, and my footing went, and I went down hard on the hillside, hands and knees on the gravel and dry grass, headlamp pointed at the dirt. I stayed there for a second, just breathing. The night air hit me and it was cold and it smelled like sage and dust and nothing else. I stayed on my hands and knees and listened. No breathing from the fissure, no sound at all except wind moving through the scrub somewhere below. I got up. Salinas was gone. I swept the headlamp left, then right, then back left again, like that was going to change anything. The hillside was empty. Dry scrub, loose gravel, the dark outline of the trail cutting down through the brush toward the parking area. No Salinas, just the night and the wind and the smell of sage. His equipment bag was sitting open about 20 feet from the fissure, the kind of open where things had spilled out of it. A water bottle on its side, a folded topo map, one of those small orange emergency whistles that nobody ever uses. Everything just scattered on the ground like he'd dropped the whole thing mid-step. His radio was next to it, smashed. Not dropped and cracked, not scuffed from a fall, smashed. The casing was split open and the battery pack was separate from the body, and there was a clear boot-shaped impression in the dirt next to it, except it wasn't from a boot. It was from something that had pressed down on the radio deliberately. The shape was wrong for a boot. Too narrow at the back, too wide across the middle. I stood there with the empty tranq rifle and looked at all of it. I'm not great at the part where I have to accept that a thing happened. I can work the evidence fine. I've been doing that for 11 years, but there's always this moment where the evidence says one thing and my brain is still running about 4 steps behind it, still filing through alternative explanations, still trying to find the version where the answer is something boring. Coyote, weather, guy who wandered off to use the bathroom. The drag marks ended that. I dropped the beam to the dirt between the equipment bag and the fissure, and there they were, 2 parallel furrows in the gravel, maybe 18 inches apart, consistent with heels dragging. They started about 6 feet from where the bag had dropped, and they ran straight to the fissure entrance and disappeared into the gap in the rock. I followed them with the light all the way to the edge, and then I stopped. The creature had another way out. That was the only explanation. While I'd been underground following drag marks and running for my life, it had come out somewhere else, come around and taken Salinas from the hillside. And then it had gone back in the same way it came out, through some passage nobody had mapped. And now Salinas was somewhere inside Lehman Caves, with a thing that had already killed 3 people and arranged the bodies in a circle. That part took me a minute to fully sit with. I didn't go back to the fissure. I want to be clear about that. I stood there and I thought about it for maybe 15 seconds, and then I decided no, because I had an empty tranq rifle and a thermal scanner, and whatever the dart had hit in there, it hadn't gone down. It had slowed for 2 seconds and then kept coming. I had no way to know if a second dart would do anything different. I had no backup. I had no radio contact. Going back in alone with no working equipment and no communication was just a way to end up in the chamber with the other 3. I pulled out my phone. The signal was weak, 1 bar, flickering between 1 and nothing. I moved uphill about 30 feet until it steadied at 2 bars, and I called the Park Service dispatch number I had stored from the initial briefing with Salinas. It rang 4 times. Someone picked up. I kept it short. 3 bodies in a backcountry chamber off the main cave system, accessed through an unmapped fissure approximately 100 yards north-northeast of the marked trail. 1 missing adult male, Clyde Salinas, wildlife biologist. Last confirmed location the hillside outside the fissure, evidence of a large, unclassified animal in the system. I gave them my name, my credentials with the Nevada Department of Wildlife, my cell number, and the GPS coordinates I'd logged on the way up. I told them they needed a full recovery team with proper equipment, and that they should not send anyone in without it. The dispatcher asked if I needed medical attention. I said no. She told me to stay on site and that rangers would be dispatched. I said fine, and hung up and stood there for a second with the phone in my hand. Then I walked down to my truck. I sat in the cab with the door open and the dome light on, and I did a slow inventory. Both knees were scraped up from the fall coming out of the fissure. Not bad, but bleeding a little through the cargo pants. My left palm had a cut across the base of the thumb from the rock. My canvas jacket had a long tear across the right shoulder. I had 1 unused tranquilizer dart in my vest pocket, and the thermal scanner clipped to my belt, and that was about it for equipment. I got the first aid kit from the glove box and dealt with the hand. Then I sat there and waited. An hour is a long time when you're sitting in a truck in the dark at the edge of the Great Basin with nothing to do but think. I didn't turn the radio on. I just sat there and watched the trail and thought about the drag marks and the smashed radio and the 3-year-old registration that hadn't happened yet, though I didn't know about that part yet. I was still on the drag marks, still running the geometry of how the creature had come out while I was in, which meant there were at least 2 points of access to the surface, which meant the steel plate Garza would eventually put over the fissure was going to accomplish basically nothing, but I didn't know that yet either. The headlights came up the access road around 1 in the morning. White Ford F-250 with the Park Service markings, moving slow on the rough track. It pulled up about 30 feet from my truck and 2 rangers got out. The older one came around the front of the vehicle first. 6 feet, stocky, silver hair cropped close, moving with the kind of unhurried steadiness that means somebody's been doing a job long enough that nothing surprises them much anymore. He had the standard tan and green uniform and a well-worn duty belt, and he walked toward me like he had all the time in the world. "Benny Lloyd?" he said. "Yeah." "Carter Garza?" He didn't offer a hand, just nodded once. "You want to walk me through it?" The younger one had come around the passenger side and was standing back a few feet, arms loose, watching me with a flat expression. Clean uniform, neat dark hair, the kind of squared-away posture that's still a little deliberate. He didn't introduce himself right away. He just looked at me the way people look at someone they've already made a decision about. I walked Garza through it. All of it. The fissure, the passage, the chamber, the 3 bodies arranged in the circle, the thermal readings, the chase, the dart, the drag marks outside. I took him up the trail to the fissure entrance and showed him the equipment bag and the smashed radio and the drag marks in the gravel. I showed him where they started and where they ended. He crouched down and looked at them with a flashlight for a long time without saying anything. Mike, the younger one, had followed us up. He was looking at the drag marks too. Then he looked at me. He didn't say anything, but his expression said it. I unclipped the thermal scanner and handed it to Garza. Footage is on there, everything from when I entered. The heat signature, the movement pattern, all of it. Garza took it and turned it over in his hands. "You said the signature was large." I recalibrated twice. The reading was accurate. He nodded slowly, didn't push back on it. Just stood there with the scanner and looked at the fissure entrance and then back down the hill toward the trail. "We found a vehicle at the trailhead when we came in," he said. He said it carefully, like he was choosing the order of the words. "Registered to a Clyde Salinas." "That's not possible," I said. "I drove up with him. He was in my truck." Garza looked at me. "Registration in the glove box is 3 years old." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't have anything to say. I just stood there on the hillside with the wind moving through the scrub below us and the dark mouth of the fissure about 10 feet away, and I had no explanation. Taylor didn't say anything either. That surprised me a little. I'd figured he'd push back on the registration thing, use it to reframe everything else I'd told them. He just stood there with his hands on his hips looking at the fissure entrance. Maybe he was doing the math the same way I was. Maybe he'd already decided I was unreliable and didn't see the point. Hard to say. Garza made some calls. I sat on a rock about 30 feet from the fissure and drank the last of the water from my pack and waited. The wind had picked up. It was cold in the way the desert gets cold at night, fast and total, like someone just turned it off. I zipped my jacket and watched the beam of Taylor's headlamp move back and forth along the hillside below the fissure while he photographed the drag marks. The recovery team arrived around 11. 6 people in 2 vehicles, a white park service truck and a gray van with equipment cases stacked in the back. They came up the trail with a lot of gear and not a lot of conversation, which I respected. I'd worked with teams that needed to talk through everything before they moved and teams that just moved. These were the second kind. Garza introduced me to the team lead, a woman named Dr. Reyes, short, efficient, with a headlamp already strapped to her forehead and a tablet in her hand. I walked her through what I'd told Garza. She listened without interrupting, which I also respected. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. How wide was the main passage? And had I observed the creature moving vertically on the cave walls or only at an angle? I told her the passage was roughly 8 feet at the widest point I'd seen, and that it had moved on the walls and ceiling both, not at an angle, flat against the surface. She wrote something on her tablet and nodded. Didn't react to that second part. Either she'd heard stranger things or she was very good at not reacting. I didn't ask which. They weren't going in through the fissure. Garza had already decided that, and I agreed with it. The main entrance to Lehman Caves was a 1/4 mile down the trail, a proper opening with a mapped system behind it. The chamber I'd found was connected. It had to be, based on the thermal data and the layout I'd sketched out for Garza on the back of a receipt I found in my jacket pocket. Dr. Reyes looked at the sketch for about 10 seconds and said she knew the section. Said there was a secondary passage the bat survey teams use that put you into the deeper system without going through the tourist route. I handed over the thermal scanner. She took it and passed it to someone behind her without looking. Then they went in, and I stayed out. That part was harder than I expected. Not because I wanted to go back in. I absolutely did not want to go back in. It was more that standing on the hillside with nothing to do felt wrong after everything. I kept wanting to be useful, and there was nothing left for me to be useful at. I walked back down to the trail and found a flat section of rock near the trailhead, and sat there and ate a granola bar I found in my pack that I didn't remember putting there. It was stale. Probably had been in there since the Oregon job 2 years back. I ate the whole thing anyway. Taylor came and sat nearby after a while. Not close enough that we had to talk, but close enough that I knew he was keeping an eye on me. I didn't mind. It was probably protocol. I would have done the same. Garza checked in with me twice during the wait, once around midnight to tell me the team had reached the main chamber, once around 1 in the morning to tell me they'd found the bodies. All 3, arranged the way I'd described. He said it carefully, the arranged part. Like he was still deciding what to do with that detail. I just nodded. I'd already processed it as much as I was going to. The 3 hours felt longer than 3 hours. I counted the stars for a while, which is something I do when I can't sleep in the field. I know enough of the constellations to keep myself occupied for maybe 20 minutes before I run out of ones I can name with confidence. After that, I just looked at the dark and listened to the wind and thought about Salinas' equipment bag sitting open on the hillside with his radio smashed beside it. I kept coming back to the radio. Not the vehicle registration, which I couldn't explain and had mostly stopped trying to. The radio. Because the radio was physical evidence of something happening up here while I was underground. Something had come out and done that. Smashed it deliberately, which implied it understood what the radio was for. That was the part I kept circling. Garza came back down the trail around 2:15, and I could tell from the way he was walking that he had something to tell me that he wasn't sure how to say. He sat down on the rock next to me. Taylor stayed where he was. We found evidence of a fourth person in the chamber, Garza said. Recent, within the last 48 hours, they're estimating. Salinas. Probably. We didn't find him. He paused. We're still working the system, but the team lead thinks they've covered the accessible sections. I didn't say anything. There's one more thing. He held out a small evidence bag. Inside was a tranquilizer dart. My tranquilizer dart, or one exactly like it, from the same kit. Found it near the passage junction, about 40 feet from the fissure entrance on the interior side. I took the bag and looked at it. The dart was clean. The needle was intact. The compound chamber hadn't discharged. It's unused, Garza said. I heard it hit something. I know. That's what you reported. I turned the bag over. The dart was in perfect condition. No impact damage, no trace of whatever it had supposedly struck. No reason at all to believe it had connected with anything. I handed it back. I heard it hit, I said again. I wasn't arguing with him. I was just saying it because it was true, and I needed it to stay true even if the evidence said otherwise. He took the bag back and didn't push back on it. Just put it in his jacket pocket and sat there with me for a minute. The team came out around 3. Dr. Reyes gave Garza a rundown I was close enough to hear most of. 3 bodies recovered, fourth person unaccounted for. Cave system showed signs of extensive undocumented passage networks in the deeper sections. She said the thermal scanner footage was going to require analysis she couldn't do in the field. She said it twice. After that, Garza and 2 of the team members went back up to the fissure with a steel plate and a cordless drill. I watched them from the trail. It took about 20 minutes. When they were done, there was a steel plate bolted over the fissure entrance and a padlock through the hasp. I looked at that padlock for a while. It was a good padlock, heavy duty, the kind that doesn't rust. Garza had done it right, done everything he could do. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that the creature had come out of that fissure while I was inside the cave system, which meant it had used an exit that wasn't the fissure, which meant the fissure wasn't the only way in or out, which meant the steel plate and the padlock were keeping out exactly no one. I didn't say that to Garza. He knew. I could tell from the way he looked at the plate after he locked it, that same careful expression he'd had when he told me about the registration. He knew what it was and wasn't. I walked back down to my truck. Taylor was already at the white Ford loading equipment. Garza caught up with me at the trailhead and got my contact information and told me the Park Service would be in touch for a formal statement. I gave him my card, then I got in my truck and drove back toward Ely. It was about an hour and 40 minutes in the dark on Route 50. No other cars, just the headlights and the flat desert on both sides and the mountains somewhere out there in the black. I had the heat on. I had the radio off. I thought about the dart the whole way. The Ely Motor Inn was on Altman Street, about 3 blocks from the Jailhouse Casino. I'd stayed there maybe a dozen times over the years. They had a mini fridge that hummed loud and a desk lamp with a pull chain and the kind of bedspread that's been washed so many times it's basically tissue paper. I knew the room. That was fine. I got in around midnight, maybe a little after, dropped my gear bag by the door, took off my boots and sat at the desk. I had my laptop open and the Nevada Dow incident report template pulled up before I'd even turned the desk lamp on. I knew the form well enough to fill it out in the dark. I'm not great at writing those, honestly. I always get stuck on the classification fields. The form had a drop-down for creature type. I'd used most of them at some point. Ursid, canid, unknown cervid, unverified primate. There was a catch-all at the bottom that just said unclassified, and I'd used it twice in 11 years. Once for something in the Ruby Mountains that I never got a clear look at. Once for a track pattern near Winnemucca that didn't match anything in any database I had access to. Tonight made 3. I typed unclassified and moved on. Origin field was next. I put unknown. That one was easy. Behavior classification was where I slowed down. The drop-down options were things like territorial, defensive, opportunistic predation. None of them were quite right. I sat there for a minute with my hand on the trackpad, and then I typed it manually into the notes field instead. Behavior consistent with intelligent predation. I thought about that for a second after I typed it, then left it. The thing about intelligent predation is it implies planning. It implies the creature understood what it was doing and made choices about it. The 3 bodies arranged in a circle implied the same thing. I hadn't put that in the behavior field. I put it in the notes section, which is where I put things I can't classify but also can't leave out. Victims arranged in deliberate radial pattern. No apparent feeding behavior. Arrangement suggests purposeful placement. I stared at that sentence for a while. Then I got to the section on movement and range, which is where I had to write the part that had been sitting in the back of my head since the recovery team told me about the dart. I'd gone into that fissure thinking I was dealing with a large cave-adapted predator. Something that lived in the dark, hunted by sound or heat, stayed underground because that was its habitat. That's the framework I'd brought in with me. That framework was wrong. Whatever this was, it had been in 2 places at the same time, or close enough to the same time that the difference didn't matter. It had been chasing me through the cave system, while simultaneously coming out of another exit and taking Salinas off the hillside. I didn't know if that meant there were 2 of them, or one of them that moved faster than anything I'd clocked in a cave before. I didn't know. I put both possibilities in the report and noted that the scanner footage would need independent analysis because I couldn't be objective about it anymore. That was probably the most honest thing I wrote all night. The dart section was short. I wrote that I'd discharged the tranquilizer rifle once during the pursuit, that I'd heard contact with the surface, and that the dart had been recovered unused near the fissure entrance. I noted that this was inconsistent with my auditory impression at the time of discharge. I noted that I had no explanation for the discrepancy. That was it. 4 sentences. I could have written more, but I didn't know what else to say that wasn't just me speculating, and speculation goes in the notes field, not the incident field, and I'd already used up a lot of the notes field. I finished the report around 1:30, saved it, attached the thermal scanner footage file, and sent it to my supervisor at Dow with a flag for urgent review. Then I printed a hard copy on the little inkjet printer I travel with because the Dow requires a physical copy for anything involving a fatality. The printer was slow and the ink was getting low and the pages came out a little streaky. I stacked them and set the report on the desk next to the lamp. Then I lay down on the bed without taking off my jacket. The air conditioning unit was under the window and it ran in cycles. Loud, then quiet, then loud again. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and a little like cigarettes, even though the sign on the door said no smoking. The bedspread was exactly as thin as I remembered. I stared at the ceiling. I kept coming back to the registration. 3 years old, Garza had said. The registration in Salinas' glove box was 3 years old. I'd driven up to the park with Salinas that morning. I'd sat in his truck. It was a gray Tacoma with a cracked dashboard mount for his phone and a field guide to Nevada mammals wedged between the seats. I'd seen it. I'd been in it. The registration being 3 years old didn't mean anything by itself. People let registrations lapse. But Garza had said it like it meant something, and I'd been too rattled to ask him what. I didn't have an explanation for it. I kept trying to build one and kept running out of road. The smashed radio was easier to sit with because at least I understood what it meant. The creature had been there. It had found Salinas' equipment, and it had dealt with the radio specifically, which was the one thing that could have brought help faster. That implied it understood what the radio was for. which looped back to intelligent predation and the circle of bodies and the whole thing I was trying not to think about too directly. The breathing, that was the other thing. It had come from everywhere at once, not directional, not localized. I'd worked enough cave acoustics to know sound moves weird underground, bounces off limestone, doubles back on itself. But this hadn't felt like that. It had felt like the rock itself was breathing. I knew that wasn't possible. I put it in the notes field anyway because it was what I'd experienced, and the notes field was where the things went that I couldn't explain but couldn't leave out. Salinas. I kept arriving at Salinas. The recovery team had gone through the chamber, through the passage, through the whole accessible section of the cave system, and they hadn't found him. They'd found evidence of a fourth person recently present. That was Salinas. Or it was someone else entirely. And I wasn't ready to think about the someone else entirely option. The evidence said Salinas had been in that cave after I came out. The drag mark said the creature had taken him in through the fissure, which meant he'd been alive when it took him, because drag marks look different when the weight isn't resisting. And these marks had the kind of irregular spacing that meant the person was still moving. That was the thing I was holding on to. He was still alive. The evidence pointed that way. Not strongly, not conclusively, but it pointed, and the report on the desk next to the lamp was going to require a follow-up, which meant I was going to have to go back, which meant I needed Salinas to be alive because the alternative was that I'd sent him out there to wait alone and then driven away. The air conditioning cycled back on, loud, then settling into that steady mechanical hum. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. I wasn't going to sleep. I knew that already. The air conditioning ran. That was the whole night, basically. Me and the ceiling and that machine grinding away in the wall. I'd been in motel rooms like this one probably 200 times over 11 years. Baker, Nevada doesn't have a lot of options. The Stargazer Inn, which is what the sign said, though half the letters were burned out so it just said St. Gazer Inn, which sounded like a threat. The mattress had that particular stiffness that means it's either brand new or 30 years old, and this one was definitely not brand new. There was a water stain on the ceiling tile above the bed, shaped like nothing in particular. I stared at it for a long time. The dart was the thing I kept coming back to. I'd fired that rifle blind, running in the dark, with something behind me that I couldn't fully see. I'd heard it hit. I was certain I'd heard it hit. That solid thunk of a dart making contact. And the breathing had stuttered. That low chest vibration rhythm had broken for just a second, which was enough for me to make it back to the passage. I'd built my whole exit around that moment. Fired, heard contact, felt the breathing stutter, ran. The recovery team brought the dart out unused, unfired basically, still loaded. I'd turned that over in my head during the drive back from the park, and I was still turning it over now. There were a few ways it could go. One, I'd missed. The dart had hit the cave wall and the breathing had stuttered for some other reason. Two, the dart had hit but hadn't penetrated, which would tell me something about the skin. Three, something I wasn't thinking of yet. I was leaning toward option one because option one was the most boring, and in this work, the most boring answer is usually right. But the breathing had stuttered. Right after the sound of contact. That was a hard thing to set aside. I'd dropped a 600-pound cryptid in Oregon with that compound. I had one dart left in the rifle, sitting in my equipment bag on the floor next to the desk. I looked at it for a second, and then looked back at the ceiling. The three bodies in the circle bothered me more than any of it. The creature had arranged them. That was the thing. Not stacked them, not left them where they fell. Arranged them in a deliberate circle, positioned like they were sleeping. That takes time. That takes something that has a reason to do it, even if I couldn't figure out what the reason was. In 11 years, I documented things that killed and things that cached food, and things that marked territory in ways that were uncomfortable to look at. I hadn't documented anything that arranged its dead. That was a category I didn't have a file for. I thought about Salinas. He'd looked hollowed out at the visitor center. That was the word I kept using in my head. Hollowed. Like he'd been running on something other than sleep for a while, and whatever it was had started running low. He'd handed me his field notes, and they'd been meticulous right up until the last week. Then the handwriting changed, got smaller, more pressed into the page. The notes from the last 3 days were mostly just times and sounds. 3:42 a.m., breathing sound from North Passage. 4:17 a.m., same. The word breathing underlined twice in the last entry. He'd known what was in there before I did. He just hadn't been able to say it in a way that made sense until he was standing in front of it. The vehicle registration was the part I couldn't work with. I'd driven up with Salinas. I'd picked him up at the visitor center. He'd gotten in my truck on the passenger side. He'd directed me up the trail access road. We talked about the bat population study he'd been running, which was the official reason he was stationed here. He'd mentioned a colony of Townsend's big-eared bats in the upper passage that he was pretty sure hadn't been documented in that section before. That detail was specific enough that I wrote it in my notes because it was the kind of thing you write down. He'd been in my truck. He'd been real. And then Garza had walked me to the trailhead and shown me a vehicle registered 3 years ago parked right there. Salinas' name on the registration. Salinas' field equipment in the back seat. I didn't have an explanation for that. I'd written in my report that the registration discrepancy required follow-up. That was the professional way to say I have no idea what that means, and it's going to bother me indefinitely. The follow-up was the thing, though. The report on the desk was finished, printed out, signed, ready to go into the system in the morning. Classified as unclassified, origin unknown, behavior consistent with intelligent predation. I'd added a note at the bottom recommending continued monitoring of all access points to the Lehman system, including unmapped secondary exits, and I'd flagged it for the follow-up protocol, which in practical terms meant I was going back. I'd known that since I walked out of the fissure onto the hillside and found Salinas' equipment bag sitting open in the dirt. The steel plate and padlock they'd put over the fissure entrance was fine. It was the right move for public safety. But the creature had come out through a different exit while I was inside chasing its heat signature, and nobody had mapped that exit, and until somebody did, the plate and padlock were just a way of making the paperwork look cleaner. I'd noted that too. Garza had nodded when I said it out loud. Taylor had looked at his boots. I wasn't angry at Taylor. Skepticism is a reasonable response to what I'd described. I'd probably have been skeptical too if I hadn't been the one running through the dark with my headlamp catching that thing twice on the cave walls. Twice was enough. The way it moved, pressed flat against the stone, flowing rather than running, too tall, too thin, reflecting light back wrong. Twice was more than enough. The thermal scanner footage was in Garza's hands now. That would help with Taylor eventually. I put my arm over my eyes because the lamp on the desk was still on and I didn't feel like getting up to turn it off. The air conditioning ran. I thought about Salinas saying the bat colony might be undocumented in that section. I thought about his handwriting getting smaller in the last 3 days of his field notes. I thought about the drag marks with that irregular spacing that meant the weight was still resisting. He was alive in there. The evidence pointed that way, not strongly. Not in a way I could put in the report as anything more than trace evidence of recent presence, but it pointed. I'd been doing this work for 11 years, and I'd learned one consistent thing, which is that unclassified doesn't mean finished. It means you don't have enough yet. It means the file stays open. It means you go back when you have more equipment and a better plan, and maybe someone who isn't going to stand outside the fissure alone while you're underground. I was going to need a partner for the follow-up. That was a practical problem I hadn't solved yet. Most people I'd worked with in the field had a threshold, and I'd probably crossed it tonight by describing what I'd seen to Garza. I'd think about it in the morning. The lamp on the desk threw a yellow rectangle across the wall. My report sat next to it, clipped and stacked. 11 pages. The last line read, "Follow-up investigation recommended. Timeline pending resource allocation." That was the professional way to say, I'm going back in. I kept my arm over my eyes and listened to the air conditioning and thought about Salinas' bat colony in the upper passage. Undocumented, probably still there. I thought about a creature that arranged the dead in circles and came and went through exits nobody had found yet. I thought about a dart I was certain had connected and a recovery team that said otherwise. The ceiling stain was still there when I moved my arm, still shaped like nothing. I reached over and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. I wasn't going to sleep, but I was going to lie there and let my eyes rest and think through the follow-up plan until it was light enough to drive. Baker to Ely was 2 hours. I knew the route. I'd driven it in the dark before. I closed my eyes. The work wasn't finished. It wasn't close to finished. But I was still here, and the file was still open, and that was enough to start with.